Hello, it's Whitney, your friendly neighborhood academic writing specialist, and you probably saw I posted some online resources and an attached document for you in an announcement earlier tonight, but in addition to that, Dr. Marfell wanted me to make you a quick video to kind of touch on some key points with regard to making an evidence table and making a synthesis table, and synthesis in general, which can be a tricky concept. So you have this assignment. I've got it open here on the screen, as you can see, Patient Safety Evidence Review. I believe you're supposed to have 5 articles, and those examine the effectiveness of a tool, I believe. And then, so you locate your 5 primary sources of evidence, you make your evidence table, then you develop a synthesis table of the findings, just the findings from those 5 studies, and then you present a summary of key findings from the evidence. And actually, I would call it a synthesis, not a summary. We're going to talk in just a minute about what the difference between those two things is. And then based on the evidence review, you'll make a recommendation for how to use this strategy in practice, which really is the point. To a large extent of making a table like this. So a lot of people will use these in evidence-based practice. You know, the speed with which research happens in this country, you would have to read 17 articles a day every year, no weekends off, to keep current on the latest research. So you can see how valuable things like this are, because it takes a large body of evidence and it sort of synthesizes it down, boils it down to the take-home messages, the most important things people need to know. So it's very, very useful in that regard. So let's have a look. Your professors have made a template for you, and they went ahead and plugged in some actual studies. So we're not going to go over this whole thing. I just want to show you what columns you want to have in this thing. So you're going to have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns, it looks like. And I'm going to actually suggest that either you add one more or that you let one column serve double duty, because I would like to see an implications column as well. Because if you can focus in your table on implications for practice, it's going to make the synthesis part of your assignment way, way easier. And we were talking about using tables like this in evidence-based practice a minute ago. The other really useful thing for a table like this, which is ultimately going to lead us to evidence-based practice anyway, is that they make the writing of a literature review manuscript so much easier. If you do a good enough job with an evidence table, that paper is going to write itself. And you're going to write plenty of literature reviews in this program. So it's a good thing to learn how to do this. So here's your template. So you're going to note the author and year for every study, your study design and purpose, and you see how they've broken it down, you know, here's design, here's purpose, your sample characteristics and the setting for the study, your variables, independent and dependent, data analysis, main findings, and evidence level. And evidence level is important because it tells us how big a grain of salt do we have to take these recommendations with, basically, right? So, you know, there are varying levels of rigor and varying levels of kind of certainty, I guess. And, you know, so it's important to note the level of evidence so that you're clear on all of that. Because, you know, the last thing you want to do is create a flawed picture of what we know. You know, like, you might come up with a lot of consistent findings, but if they're all from rather, you know, low evidence level studies, then, you know, we still have to take it with a grain of salt. So those are your columns. And then the professor wants you to use this little legend down here that has some abbreviations in it, and they ask you to use like a down arrow for decrease and an up arrow for increase, the pound signal for number, things like that. So make sure you have a look at that so that you adhere to your prompt with regard to that. So that's your template. And then I want to also show you the template for the synthesis table, okay? Now, the evidence table is all your information. You just saw those columns. There's all kinds of info in there. Once you get it to the synthesis table, that's where you're zeroing in just on the main findings, just on the results, okay? And you're presenting them concisely and clearly. That's the benefit of a table across the board, be it an evidence table or a synthesis table or whatever, is you're taking a large body of info, large body of evidence, and you're crystallizing it down to something that's visual and concise and easy to process, right? So once you get to your synthesis table, you have your question up here, And then variables of interest, by which we mean outcomes that they were examining. And then there's your 5 studies, and you can use a plus for increase, a minus for decrease, or an NE for not evaluated. Okay, and then they've got these little superscript letters down here for higher level evidence, statistically significant findings, statistical significance not reported. So again, we're crystallizing down, we're just talking about results in this table, and this is going to make it very visual, very easy to see. So as I said up here, for the regular evidence table, you might want to add a column for implications. And if you want to just stick it in there with main findings, you could do that if it's too squished to add a whole other column. But the reason why that's important is that the last part of your assignment, once you've done your evidence table and your synthesis table, is this little baby right here where you're going to synthesize the key findings. And you're going to look at limitations of this body of evidence. That's important because that is, of course, the so what question. It's the take-home message. It's why do we care? What are we getting out of this? Why do we need to know this? And then the very end, the lid on the pot is the recommendation for practice. So basically it's like, those pointillist paintings where it's just a bunch of tiny little dots. You can think of every individual study as one of those little dots. And the closer you get to it, the less precise the picture is. It's just a bunch of dots. But once you step back from the picture and you get that kind of bird's eye view and that big picture view, that's where you come up with your synthesis, your recommendations for practice. And I want to show you something that I think really crystallizes quite well the difference between summary and synthesis, and defines synthesis really, really nicely. So let's have a look at this slide. Oops, it's not going to show. Let me see if I can make this box bigger. Let me see. Can I make this box bigger? Yeah, maybe not. Okay, that's okay. Oh dear, what have I done here? It's doing something weird to my screen where I can't see my forwards and backwards. Okay, bear with me for a second, y'all. We're just gonna scrap. All right, there we go. Technical difficulties. Okay, so we'll just keep it on this screen. That's fine. So these slides, or at least some of them, are from the Walden University Writing Center, which is a terrific online resource. If you've never checked it out, you should, because they've got lots of great writing resources. And so I wanted to kind of show you this definition of synthesis and to contrast it with summary, because I think that helps to crystallize what the definition is. So a summary is a brief description of one source's main ideas. And you do summary when you're doing something like an annotated bibliography, right? And I would say you're also summarizing in an evidence table. Synthesis, on the other hand, is a more extended explanation of ideas and trends and themes and theories and methods, sometimes across multiple sources. So you're not just going one by one. You're not just looking at study by study by study. In synthesis, you're looking at the big picture. You're looking at a body of evidence and saying, okay, I've read these 5 studies. They all have findings. What's the take-home message? What's the bird's eye view? What's the big picture from all 5 of these studies? And sometimes that means that you go through and you go down that column of results and you go down that column of implications for practice, and you can color code if it helps you. You can highlight where you've got the same finding or similar findings. Sometimes you're going to have contradictory findings too, and things that don't fit together. And oftentimes people have a tendency, and I believe Dr. Marfell actually mentioned that in her little troubleshooting checklist that she gave you, which I thought was so great, that people tend to want to avoid messiness. And so what people will often do is only include the similar findings and only include, the positive findings where the intervention worked. Well, sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes researchers will end up with a completely surprising result, and they won't prove their hypothesis, and they'll be very confused. And sometimes when you're doing a literature review, you get all kinds of contradictory findings. But remember, our goal is not to necessarily argue one particular point of view. Our goal is to just look at what the literature says. Okay, so you gotta deal with the mess. And that's a big part of synthesis. Sometimes it's all very neat and tidy, and you've got themes that are consistent across studies, but sometimes you've got mess in there, and part of synthesis is dealing with that mess. So you might say, okay, I've got two studies with completely opposite findings here. What's the deal with that? Might there be something in the methodology that caused that? Might there be something in the sampling? Might this just be a gap where there's some kind of key element that was left out that we need to do further research to address? You know, so that's what we mean when we talk about synthesis. It's getting that bird's eye view of a body of evidence. And the same thing kind of applies when you get to the limitations part of this assignment. So every study that you look at should have a section where they talk about their own limitations. And all you have to do is just, again, go down that column and look at the bird's eye view where, okay, in this body of evidence, which is comprised of 5 studies, are there common limitations? Do they all have small sample sizes? Do they all have convenient samples instead of random samples? Because random samples are typically better, right? So those are sorts of questions that you're going to want to look at. And if you do a good enough job on your evidence table, that synthesis is going to be super easy because it really helps you zero in on those similarities and differences. Let me look at my notes really quickly. All right, so now let's move on. Let's see, was there another slide I wanted to show you? Yeah, actually, let me show you this first. So this is just a little slide that shows a few examples of synthesis language. Now, you're not necessarily doing this in this assignment, but this is the next logical step if you're writing a literature review. So, and I think it'll help you understand what I mean by synthesis in the first place. So when you see things like Schwester reported results consistent with findings in Hills and Yau's studies. So there's a writer who's had consistent findings across multiple studies. And it's important to know that because when you've got multiple researchers or teams of researchers coming up with the same thing, then that can tend to mean that, hey, guess what? This is the truth and we need to pursue it. Keller found that X occurred. Likewise, Dahl found that X occurred, but also noted that the effects of X differed from those suggested by Keller. So here we've got one where it's a little complicated. It's like these two researchers found the same thing, sort of, but this one noted that there were some different effects. So, similar, but also a little bit different. And then although Mahmoud suggested X, O'Donnell recommended a different approach. And here we've got two that are kind of contradictory. All right. So I think that was all I wanted to show you with regard to synthesis. But have a look in that announcement that I posted because I included an attached document there that's a real excerpt from a real student's literature review, where the original draft that I worked with the student on was very much a summary instead of a synthesis. It was very annotated bibliography-like. It was just kind of study 1 said this, and study 2 said this, and study 3 said this, which again is not a synthesis. That's not telling me what the whole body of literature says in terms of main ideas. So we worked together to turn that summary into a synthesis, and I have before and after there for you so you can see the difference. And I think that's going to be really, really helpful to you, not only in terms of wrapping your heads around what Dr. Marfell is asking for when she asks you for a synthesis, but also when it's time to write an actual paper out of all this. It's going to make it a lot easier for you. Okay, so now let's move on because there are a few points that I really want to touch on from this evidence review checklist that Dr. Marfell has made for you. And I won't read the whole thing to you because you don't need me to, but I want to touch on a few points that are kind of writing related. So the first one right here, this is really important. Make sure all your articles have been published in the past 5 years. Okay, so your articles shouldn't be older than 5 years old. Now, sometimes in certain types of situations, it's okay to use older sources. For example, if you're dealing with a landmark study or a classic study, a study that sort of was seminal and everybody always cites it, then that's one thing. But more often than not, you want to limit yourself to the past 5 years, especially if you're writing about an area that is kind of ever-changing. Like, for example, if you're writing about simulation or anything technology-based, think how fast technology evolves. Even something that's 6 or 7 years old could be completely obsolete. So it's important to, be current. Now, the second one is important too. Do each of your articles report on a primary research study? This is something that I found myself